There are things in this world that carry a person's entire soul, and nobody notices. A woman once stood in the middle of a dusty town square, surrounded by people who looked straight through her like she was made of glass. In her arms she held a quilt. Not just fabric and thread. Not just cotton and color. She held 3 months of sleepless nights. She held memories of a dead mother's hands guiding hers. She held every ounce of love she had left in her tired, aching body, folded neatly into something beautiful. And nobody wanted it. They walked past. They laughed. One man nudged his friend and said something under his breath. A woman wrinkled her nose like the quilt smelled of failure. The auctioneer's voice cracked with pity as he tried one last time to get a single bid. Silence. The kind of silence that breaks a person in half. She was about to pick up her quilts and walk away from that square, from that town, maybe from everything, when something happened that changed the course of 2 broken lives forever. A hand rose in the back of the crowd. Slow. Steady. Silent. It belonged to a man nobody knew. A cowboy who hadn't spoken a single word since the day he rode into town. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. Sending love your way, wherever you are. This is the story of the woman who stitched her heart into cloth, and the silent man who was the only one who understood what she was saying. The cabin sat at the far eastern edge of Jessup Hollow, where the town's last dirt road gave up trying and dissolved into wild grass and sage. It was small. Weathered. The porch leaned slightly to the left, and the roof had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt itself, mismatched shingles layered over each other like the scales of some tired, sleeping creature. This was where Clara Willoughby lived. Alone. She had been alone for 6 years now, ever since her husband Thomas caught fever during a brutal winter and died in that very cabin, in that very bed. With her hand on his chest and his last breath fogging the cold air between them. She was 31 years old then. She was 37 now, and the years in between had passed like slow water over stone, wearing her down in ways nobody could see. But Clara didn't sit idle in her grief. She couldn't. Stillness was a kind of death to her. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. The thing her mother had taught her before consumption took her, too. She quilted. Every morning, before the sun broke over the eastern ridge, Clara sat at the wooden frame Thomas had built for her as a wedding gift. It was the one piece of furniture she kept polished. The one thing in that cabin that still looked like it belonged to someone who cared about living. She would light a candle, thread her needle, and begin. Her quilts were not ordinary. Most women in the territory made quilts for warmth. Practical things. Simple patterns, squares, triangles, the occasional star. Serviceable. Sturdy. Nothing more. Clara's quilts were different. Each one was a painting made from cloth. She used fabric she dyed herself, boiling roots and berries and wildflowers to pull color from the earth. Deep indigos from elderberry. Warm golds from chamomile. Reds so rich they looked like dried blood in certain light. And she stitched them into scenes. Landscapes. Faces. Moments frozen in thread. One quilt showed the view from her mother's porch in Missouri, a wide open field of bluebonnets under a sky turning violet at dusk. Another captured the silhouette of Thomas standing in the doorway of their cabin, his shoulders broad, his hat tilted slightly the way he always wore it. You could almost see him breathing. She stitched sunsets and storms, rivers and ridgelines, grief and grace, all into fabric. Each quilt took her weeks, sometimes months. And when she finished one, she would hold it up to the window, let the light pass through it, and study it the way a painter studies a canvas. Then she would fold it carefully, carry it into town, and try to sell it. This was the part that broke her. The general store in Jessup Hollow was run by a man named Horace Pepin, a round, sweating man with kind enough eyes but no spine to speak of. Clara had left quilts on consignment with Horace 3 times that year. Each time, weeks later, he'd return them to her with an apologetic shrug. Folks just ain't buying fancy quilts, Clara. They want plain ones. Ones that keep warm. Yours are, well, they're real pretty, but. He never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. She understood. Her quilts were too strange. Too personal. Too much of her in every stitch. People didn't want to wrap themselves in someone else's grief. They didn't want art. They wanted wool and warmth, and nothing that made them think too hard. Clara would carry the quilts home in silence, stack them in the corner of her cabin, and sit down at the frame to begin another one. Because what else could she do? The quilts were the only language she had left. The only way she knew how to say, I am still here. I still feel. I still remember. On the last Saturday of September, a notice was tacked to the post outside Horace's store. Autumn auction, October 12th, all goods welcome, Jessup Hollow Town Square. Clara stood in front of that notice for a long time. The wind tugged at her dress. Dust settled on her boots. She read the words 3 times, as if they might change meaning. Then she walked home and pulled out her 3 finest quilts. She would try one more time. Just once more. October 12th came wrapped in a gray sky and the smell of wood smoke. The town square of Jessup Hollow wasn't much of a square, just a flattened patch of earth between the general store, the saloon, the feed barn, and the small wooden church that leaned eastward like it was tired of standing. But on auction day, it came alive. Tables were dragged out. Crates stacked. Horses tied to every post. Families came in from surrounding ranches, their wagons rattling down the road since dawn. Clara arrived early. She wore her cleanest dress, a faded blue cotton, patched at the elbows but pressed with care. She carried her 3 quilts folded in a canvas sack, held against her chest like something fragile. Something alive. The auctioneer was a man named Virgil Tate, tall, thin, with a voice that could carry across a canyon. He was already setting up his podium when Clara approached. "Mornin', Clara. You bringin' those quilts again?" She nodded. Virgil looked at her the way people look at a dog that keeps limping back to a door that won't open. Pity. Not cruelty, but not kindness either. Something worse, the absence of expectation. "I'll put 'em up after the livestock and the tools," he said. "That's when the crowd thins out some." She understood what he meant. He'd auction her quilts when fewer people were watching. So the rejection would be quieter. More private. Clara set up her quilts on a table near the edge of the square. She unfolded each one carefully, smoothing the fabric with her palms. The first was a winter scene, bare trees standing like skeletons against a white sky, with a single red cardinal perched on a branch. The second showed a woman's hands, her mother's hands, kneading bread on a wooden table, flour dusting the air like snow. The third was the most personal. It was a view from inside a dark room, looking out through an open door at a field of golden grass, and standing in that field was a man. Thomas. His back turned. Walking away. She had stitched that one through tears. People passed her table throughout the morning. A few glanced. Most didn't. 2 women stopped, touched the fabric, then moved on without a word. A rancher picked up the corner of one quilt, rubbed it between his fingers like he was testing horse blanket material, then dropped it. "Too thin," he muttered. A group of young women whispered and giggled as they walked past. Clara heard one of them say, "She's at it again. Poor thing. Somebody should tell her to just make normal quilts like everybody else." Clara's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. She looked down at the stitching, her mother's hands, rendered in thread, so precise you could see the knuckles, the veins, the love, and something inside her cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a hairline fracture across her chest that she felt all the way down to her stomach. The auction moved through its lots. Cattle sold. Tools sold. A wagon wheel sold. Sacks of grain. Jars of preserves. A rocking chair. Everything sold. Then Virgil called her quilts. Next up, folks, 3 handmade quilts from Miss Clara Willoughby. Fine craftsmanship. Real detailed work. Let's start the bidding at $2. Silence. The crowd had thinned, just as Virgil had predicted. Maybe 30 people remained. Some were packing up. Others were talking amongst themselves, not even listening. $2, folks. Surely someone needs a good quilt before winter? Nothing. Clara stood at the side of the square, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw tight. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The humiliation wasn't new, but it never got easier. Every time felt like the first time. Every silence was a verdict. $1 then? Virgil tried, his voice losing its showman's edge. He sounded tired now. Uncomfortable. Come on, folks. $1 for handmade work. A man near the front snorted. I wouldn't use those to wipe down my horse. Laughter. Scattered but enough. Clara's vision blurred. She reached for the quilts, ready to fold them up, to take them home, to stack them in that corner with all the others nobody wanted. Then a hand rose. It came from the very back of the remaining crowd. Slow. Deliberate. A hand in a worn leather glove, attached to an arm in a dust-covered coat, attached to a man standing perfectly still in the shadow between the feed barn and the church. Virgil squinted. Do I have a bid? Sir, is that a bid? The man nodded once. $1? Do I hear $1 from the gentleman in the back? The man held up 3 fingers. $3? Virgil blinked. $3 for all 3 quilts? The man shook his head. Then he pointed at one quilt. The third one. The one with Thomas walking into the golden field. $3. For one quilt. Virgil's mouth opened slightly. $3 for the one quilt. Sold. The crack of the gavel echoed across the square like a gunshot. Clara stared at the man in the back. He stepped forward just enough for the light to catch him, tall, lean, trail-worn. A face carved by sun and time. Eyes the color of deep water. And a silence around him so thick it seemed to push the air aside. He walked to the table. Placed $3 silver down without a word. Picked up the quilt. Looked at Clara for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for her to feel something shift inside her chest, like a locked door being tested. Then he turned and walked away. No name. No words. Nothing. Clara stood there, 3 coins in her palm, watching a stranger carry her grief gently under his arm and disappear down the road. His name was Elias Cade, though nobody in Jessup Hollow knew that yet. He had ridden into town 3 weeks before the auction on a buckskin mare so dusty she looked gray. He'd stopped at the general store, pointed at a few supplies, flour, salt, a tin of coffee, placed his coins on the counter, and left. Horace Pepin had tried to make conversation. Where you from? Passing through? Staying long? Elias hadn't answered. Not a word. Not a grunt. He simply gathered his things, nodded once, and walked out into the afternoon heat. He made camp about a mile north of town, near a creek that bent through a stand of cottonwoods. It wasn't much, a canvas lean-to, a fire ring built from creek stones, a bedroll, a saddle propped against a tree. The kind of camp a man builds when he's not planning to stay but hasn't yet found a reason to leave. The town noticed him, the way small towns always notice strangers. Eyes from windows. Whispers at the mercantile. Theories traded over glasses of whiskey at the saloon. He's running from the law, said one man. Maybe he's simple in the head, offered another. I heard the mute ones are the dangerous ones, a woman said, pulling her children closer as Elias walked past one morning. None of them tried to talk to him. None of them asked. They simply assigned him a story that made sense to them and moved on. But Elias Cade had his own story, and it was nothing any of them could have guessed. 3 years earlier, Elias had been a different man. He'd been a ranch foreman outside of Abilene, a steady worker, quiet by nature but not silent. He laughed sometimes. He told stories by the fire. He sang hymns on Sunday mornings in a low, steady voice that his wife, Nella, said sounded like warm rain on a tin roof. They had a daughter, May. She was 4 years old, with hair the color of wheat and a laugh that could heal a broken day. The fire came on a Tuesday in August. Elias was riding fence line, 3 miles from the house, when he saw the smoke. By the time he reached the homestead, the cabin was an inferno. The roof had already collapsed. The heat was so intense he couldn't get within 20 feet. He screamed their names until his throat bled. He threw himself at the flames until other men pulled him back, held him down, pinned him in the dirt, while he thrashed and howled like a wounded animal. They found Nella near the door. She had been trying to get out. May was in her arms. Elias didn't speak after that. Not couldn't. Wouldn't. The words simply stopped coming. Whatever machinery inside a man that converts thought to sound had been incinerated along with everything else he loved. He opened his mouth sometimes, and nothing came. Not because his voice was broken, but because there was nothing left in him that believed words were worth saying. Words hadn't saved them. Words hadn't warned him. Words were useless, pretty things, like decorations on a coffin. He drifted. Town to town. Job to job. A week here, a month there. He mended fences, broke horses, hauled freight, any work that required hands but not conversation. He slept under stars. He ate alone. He moved through the world like a ghost wearing a man's body, present but not participating. And then he came to Jessup Hollow. He hadn't intended to stay. But on his second day in town, he'd walked past the general store and seen something in the window that stopped him cold. A quilt. Clara's quilt, one of the ones Horace had on consignment before returning it. It showed a woman standing at a window, looking out at rain. The stitching was so fine, so impossibly detailed, that for a moment Elias thought it was a painting. But it wasn't. It was cloth and thread. Someone had taken grief. He recognized grief when he saw it, and turned it into something that could be held. He stood outside that window for 20 minutes, staring at the quilt, his breath catching in ways he didn't understand. When Horace came out and said it wasn't for sale anymore, the woman had taken it back. Something shifted behind Elias's eyes. He stayed. He stayed and waited and listened, the way a man who doesn't speak learns to listen. He heard about the auction. He heard about Clara. He heard the dismissive way people talked about her quilts. Peculiar, too sad, waste of good fabric. And on October 12th, he stood at the back of a crowd and raised his hand. Now, the evening after the auction, Clara Willoughby stood on her porch and looked north, toward the Cottonwood Creek where people said the silent stranger camped. $3 silver sat on her kitchen table. The other 2 quilts leaned against the wall. She had a loaf of bread cooling on the counter and a pot of rabbit stew still warm on the stove. She picked up the bread. She ladled stew into a covered pail. And she started walking. She found his camp just before dusk. The light was doing that thing it does in autumn, going amber and thick, like honey poured over the world. The cottonwoods had begun to turn, their leaves edged in gold, trembling in a breeze so gentle it barely stirred the smoke rising from Elias's fire. He was sitting on a log, whittling. He looked up when he heard her footsteps in the dry leaves. His knife paused. His eyes found hers, and for a moment neither of them moved. Clara held up the bread and the pail of stew. "I brought you supper," she said. "To thank you? For what you did today." Elias looked at the food. Then at her. Then he nodded and gestured toward the fire. "Sit." She sat on a flat stone across from him and set the food between them. He ate slowly, deliberately, the way a man eats who has learned not to take meals for granted. He tore the bread in 2 and offered half back to her. She took it. They ate together in silence, and Clara noticed something remarkable. The silence wasn't awkward. She had spent 6 years alone, and loneliness had its own silence, heavy, pressing, like a hand over her mouth. This was different. This silence had room in it. It breathed. It didn't demand to be filled. When she looked up from her food, she saw the quilt. He had hung it between two cottonwood trees, stretched flat, the way you might hang a painting in a parlor. The golden field glowed in the fading light. Thomas's silhouette stood darkly against it, walking away, forever walking away. The fabric rippled slightly in the breeze, and for one disorienting moment, it looked like Thomas was actually moving. Clara's breath caught. "You hung it up," she said softly. Elias followed her gaze to the quilt. He nodded. "Most people would use it for a blanket. For warmth." He shook his head slowly. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He opened it, took a pencil stub from his pocket, and wrote something. Then he turned the notebook toward her. "It's not a blanket. It's a story." Clara read the words twice. Her eyes stung. She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the quilt hanging between the trees. "That's my husband," she said quietly. "Thomas. He died 6 years ago. That quilt it's the last morning I saw him standing. He was in the field, checking the grass before winter. I was watching him from inside the cabin. I didn't know it would be the last time I saw him standing upright." She paused. Her voice had gone thin, like thread pulled too tight. "I stitched it so I wouldn't forget what it looked like. Him in that field. The light. The way the grass moved." Elias listened. He didn't nod in that performative way people do when they're waiting for their turn to speak. He listened with his whole body, still, focused, absorbing every word like dry earth taking in rain. Then he wrote again. "I understand losing someone you can still see." Clara read it and looked up at him. His face was quiet, but his eyes, those deep, water-dark eyes, held something vast and unguarded. She didn't ask what he'd lost. She didn't need to. She could see it the way you can see a canyon from its edge, the depth, the emptiness, the evidence of something that was once whole and had been torn apart by forces beyond human resistance. "What's your name?" she asked. He wrote, "Elias." "I'm Clara." He nodded. She suspected he already knew. They sat together until the fire burned low and the stars came out, thick and bright the way they only get in country far from any city light. Clara told him about her mother, how she'd learned to quilt at 7 years old, sitting on her mother's lap, guided by patient hands. How her mother said that every quilt was a letter to someone who might not be born yet. "You're writing to the future, Clara girl. You're telling them what it was like to be alive right now." Elias listened to all of it. And when Clara finally stood to leave, he walked her to the edge of the tree line, where the path back to town began. He touched the brim of his hat. She nodded. The next morning, Clara found a stack of firewood neatly piled beside her cabin door. She hadn't heard him come. Over the weeks that followed, a rhythm formed between them, quiet, steady, certain. Clara would bring food to his camp every few days. Bread, stew, dried apples, sometimes a slice of pie if she'd had the flour for it. Elias would appear at her cabin at odd hours, mending a fence rail, replacing a cracked window pane, patching the section of roof that leaked when it rained. They never arranged these visits. They simply happened, the way seasons happen, inevitable, unforced. Clara began bringing her quilting to his camp. She'd sit by the fire and stitch while he whittled or tended the horses. Sometimes she'd talk, about the quilt she was working on, about the colors she was trying to achieve, about the stories she was stitching into the fabric. Sometimes she said nothing at all. And in those wordless stretches, she felt more accompanied than she had in years. Elias communicated through his notebook. Short, careful sentences. He never wasted words, even written ones. But what he wrote carried weight. One evening, she showed him a quilt she'd just finished, a night sky over a mountain range, with a single lantern glowing in a cabin window far below. He studied it for a long time. Then he wrote, "That lantern is the loneliest and bravest thing I've ever seen." Clara pressed the notebook to her chest and closed her eyes. Nobody had ever read her quilts before. Nobody had ever understood that the stitches were sentences, the colors were emotions, the patterns were prayers. Nobody, until this man who couldn't speak, had ever heard what she was saying. Small towns have teeth. They smile at your face and bite the moment you turn around. Jessup Hollow was no different. For years, Clara had been merely pitted, the odd widow with her strange quilts, harmless, forgettable. But now she was something worse. Now she was interesting. People noticed her walking north toward the creek. They noticed the firewood by her door. They noticed that the mute stranger's horse was sometimes tied to her fence post in the middle of the day. The whispers started like smoke, thin, drifting, easy to ignore at first. "You see Clara heading out to that drifter's camp again? What do you suppose they do out there? He can't even talk. Maybe that's what she likes about him. Can't tell her she's crazy." Laughter. Low, mean laughter. The kind people use to feel bigger. It escalated. The way these things always do. Martha Pruitt, wife of the feed store owner, organized a group of women to speak with the pastor about Clara's moral situation. The pastor, a tired man named Reverend Hollis, told them he saw no evidence of sin and would appreciate if they spent less time at his door and more time minding their own homes. Martha did not take this well. One morning, Clara woke to find the quilts she'd hung on her porch line to air out had been slashed. 3 of them. Cut with a knife, long diagonal gashes that tore through the stitching like wounds. The winter scene with the cardinal, destroyed. A new piece she'd been working on, a rendering of cottonwood trees in autumn, ruined. Strips of fabric hung limp in the morning breeze like skin peeling from a body. Clara stood on her porch and stared at them. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not at first. She walked down the steps and touched the hanging shreds of the cardinal quilt, the one she'd spent 2 months on. The one where she'd mixed 3 different shades of red to get the bird's breast just right. She felt the severed threads between her fingers. Then she sat on the bottom step and put her face in her hands. She cried the way people cry when they've been holding it in so long the dam doesn't break, it disintegrates. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She cried for the quilts, yes, but also for all of it. For every dismissal. Every snicker. Every return stack from Horace's store. For every time she poured her soul into something beautiful, and the world told her it was worthless. She was still sitting there when Elias appeared. He came down the path from the north, carrying a brace of rabbits he'd snared for her. He saw her on the steps first, her hunched shoulders, her trembling frame. Then he saw the quilts. The slashed fabric twisting in the wind. He set the rabbits down. He walked to the porch line. He touched one of the ruined quilts with his fingertips, the way a man touches a wound, gently, as if it might still hurt. Then he sat beside Clara on the step. He didn't touch her. Didn't try to fix it. He just sat close enough that she could feel his warmth, his presence, his solid refusal to be anywhere else in the world at that moment. After a long time, Clara's breathing steadied. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stared at the ground between her boots. "Maybe they're right," she said hoarsely. "Maybe I am foolish. Spending all my time stitching pictures nobody wants. Living out here alone, talking to a man who can't." She stopped. Pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." Elias pulled out his notebook. He wrote for a long time, longer than usual. His pencil moved carefully, deliberately. Then he tore out the page and handed it to her. "They don't see what I see. They look at your quilts and see fabric. I look at your quilts and see a woman brave enough to stitch the truth when the whole world wants comfortable lies." The cardinal in the snow. The man walking away. The lantern in the dark. These aren't quilts, Clara. These are the most honest things in this entire territory. And honest things scare people who've built their whole lives on pretending. Clara read it 3 times. Her hands trembled. Then Elias flipped to another page in his notebook and held it out. It was a drawing. Pencil on paper, shaded with the side of the lead. It showed a woman sitting at a quilting frame beside a window. Light streamed through the glass and caught in her hair, on her hands, on the fabric beneath her fingers. The woman's face was serene, focused, completely absorbed in her work. There was something luminous about her, as if the light wasn't just coming from the window but from her. Beneath the drawing, in Elias's careful hand, "This is what beautiful looks like." Clara held the drawing for a very long time. Then she looked at Elias Cade, this man who had lost everything, who carried his silence like a scar, who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen directed at her in longer than she could remember. Recognition. Not pity. Not desire. Not even kindness, exactly. Something deeper than all of those. He saw her. The real her. The one she'd been stitching into quilts for years, hoping someone, anyone, would notice. "I'm thinking about leaving," she whispered. "Leaving Jessup Hollow. There's nothing for me here." Elias's face didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker, quick as a candle in wind. He wrote one more line and showed it to her. "Don't leave yet." Clara packed her things anyway. She spent 2 days sorting through the cabin, deciding what to take, what to leave, what to burn. The furniture would stay. The quilting frame, Thomas's wedding gift, she'd take, even if she had to strap it to the side of a wagon. The quilts she'd kept, the ones stacked in the corner that nobody wanted, she would bring as well. All 14 of them. Somewhere in this vast, sprawling territory, there had to be a place where someone would understand what she'd made. She planned to leave the morning after the November market day. She had no intention of attending the market itself. What was the point? She'd already lived through that humiliation enough times to know how it ended. On the eve of market day, she went to Elias's camp one last time. He was sitting by the fire, the quilt of Thomas in the golden field still hanging between the cottonwoods. She sat across from him and told him she was leaving in the morning. She told him she was grateful, for the firewood, for the fence rails, for listening, for seeing. She told him that his drawing was the most precious thing anyone had ever given her, and she would keep it until the day she died. Elias listened. He looked at the fire. He looked at the quilt. He looked at her. Then he wrote, "Will you do something for me first?" "What?" "Leave the quilts out on your porch tonight. All of them. I'll return them before you go." Clara frowned. "Why?" He just looked at her. Patient. Steady. That deep, quiet certainty in his eyes that she had come to trust more than any words. "All right," she said. She went home. She pulled every quilt from the corner, 14 of them, plus the 2 unsold ones from the auction, and she draped them over her porch railing, across the chairs, over the line. 16 quilts, hanging in the cool November night, their colors muted in the darkness. Then she went to bed. She didn't sleep well. She dreamed of her mother's hands, of thread pulling through fabric, of a cardinal sitting on a branch in the snow, its red breast a heartbeat against the white. She woke before dawn. The quilts were gone from the porch. Clara dressed quickly and walked toward town. The sky was beginning to lighten, that thin gray line along the eastern horizon that promises the sun but hasn't delivered it yet. The air was cold. Her breath made small clouds. The road was empty. She reached the town square and stopped. Elias had been up all night. He had taken every quilt, all 16, and hung them throughout the square. He'd strung rope between the posts of the general store and the saloon, between the church steeple and the feed barn eaves, between hitching posts and porch columns. And from these ropes, the quilts hung like banners. Like tapestries. Like stained glass windows in a cathedral made of dust and wood and prairie wind. They hung at varying heights, some low enough to touch, others high enough that you had to tilt your head back. They faced east. Every single one. Facing the place where the sun would rise. Clara walked into the square and turned in a slow circle, her hand over her mouth. The winter cardinal. The bread-making hands. The cottonwood trees. The night sky with the lonely lantern. A river at dawn. A child picking wildflowers. A woman standing in rain. A horse running through fog. The golden field. Thomas walking away, hung highest of all, right in the center, stretched between the church and the saloon like a bridge between the sacred and the broken. And then the sun came up. It broke over the ridge in a flood of amber and gold, and it hit the quilts like a spotlight finding its mark. The colors ignited. The indigos deepened to impossible blue. The reds blazed like fire. The gold shimmered and the greens pulsed, and every stitch, every thread, every painstaking detail that Clara had sewn by candlelight in her lonely cabin caught the morning sun and threw it back at the world in a silent, radiant shout. People came out of their homes. They came out because it was market day, because they had errands, because they smelled coffee brewing at the saloon. But one by one they stopped. They stood in the square and looked up at the quilts, really looked, for the first time. A woman gasped. A man removed his hat. A child pointed and said, "Mama, that bird looks real." Martha Pruitt stepped out of the feed store, saw the quilts, and her hand drifted to her chest. Her mouth opened, but no sharp words came. Because there was nothing to say. The quilts said everything. A man Clara had never seen before, a traveling merchant in a fine coat, passing through on his way to Santa Fe, walked slowly through the square, studying each quilt with the careful eye of someone who recognizes value. He stopped beneath the golden field quilt and stared at it for a long, long time. Then he turned to the gathering crowd and said, "Who made these?" Silence. People looked at each other. Then, one by one, their eyes found Clara, standing at the edge of the square in her patched blue dress, her hands still over her mouth, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "I'll buy them all," the merchant said. "Name your price." Others spoke up. Horace Pepin, suddenly seeing what had been sitting in his store all along. A rancher's wife who remembered how soft the fabric had felt under her fingers. The young women who had giggled. Even Martha Pruitt. They all wanted a quilt now. Now that the light had shown them what was always there. But Clara wasn't looking at any of them. She was looking at Elias. He stood at the far edge of the square, leaning against a post, his hat in his hands. The sunrise painted him in gold. He wasn't smiling. His face didn't know how to do that anymore, but something in his posture had changed. Something had eased. Like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd been carrying for miles and miles and miles. Clara walked toward him. The crowd parted without thinking, the way water parts for a stone. She walked until she was standing right in front of him, close enough to see the firelight of dawn in his dark, quiet eyes. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, slowly, carefully, the way you hold something you're afraid might disappear. He didn't pull away. Clara didn't leave Jessup Hollow. She sold 9 quilts that morning. The traveling merchant bought 5 and carried them to Santa Fe, where they hung in the window of a gallery and drew crowds from the street. Word spread. Within a year, Clara's quilts were known across 3 territories. Orders came by post, from ranchers' wives and railroad magnates, from schoolteachers and senators, from people who had never met her but who looked at her stitching and felt, for the first time, that someone understood what it was like to be alive and hurting and still reaching for beauty. Elias moved out of the cottonwood camp and into the lean-to beside Clara's cabin. Then, when winter came and the cold made separate sleeping foolish, he moved inside. They never married, not in the legal sense. But the town understood what they were to each other, the way you understand that a river belongs to its banks. He never spoke again. Not a single word for the rest of his life. But Clara never needed him to. She had spent years trying to speak through her quilts, pouring language into thread because the world wouldn't listen to her voice. Elias had spent years in silence because the world had taken everything his voice was for. Together they built a life in the space between sound and stillness, A life made of firelight and stitching, of shared meals and long evenings. Of the notebook passed back and forth between two people who had learned that the most important things can never be said out loud anyway. On the wall of their cabin hung the drawing, the one of Clara at her quilting frame, bathed in light. Beside it hung the golden field quilt, the one he'd bought for $3 silver at an auction where nobody else would raise their hand. And on the porch, two rocking chairs sat side by side, their runners wearing grooves into the wooden planks from years of slow, quiet motion. If you passed by on certain evenings, you'd see them there, Clara stitching, Elias whittling, a quilt draped over both their laps. The sunset painting the sky in colors no thread could ever quite capture. Sometimes, the people who see us most clearly are the ones who say nothing at all. What would you have done, if you were standing in that crowd and nobody raised their hand? Think about that. And if this story stayed with you, even for a moment, leave a comment and let me know. I'll see you in the next one.